The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all. Night Fright. Folks, tonight, a great show. We're going to be looking at Jack the Ripper. Settle in, get comfy, folks, for the next hour. Man, are we going to take you on a journey. Put your feet up, get the coffee going, the tea going, or a beverage of your choice going. Folks, the barbaric crimes of Jack the Ripper are legendary. Hollywood has no shortage of films dedicated to him. He has achieved a cult-like status, but the Ripper is no romantic figure to be entertained by nor idolized. The women he ripped open were very real people with lives, hopes, and aspirations. What I want to show tonight is that Jack the Ripper is not to be romanticized, for he is much a monster and evil as any other serial killer. The same as the likes of the Canadian serial killers Paul Bernardo, Russell Williams, and Kurt Olson. Let me begin and jump into it right away and read the following actual police surgeon's report of Jack the Ripper's last killing, that of Mary Kelly, that took place November 9th, 1988. And it reads, the body was lying naked in the middle of the bed, the shoulders flat, but the axis of the body inclined to the left side of the bed. The legs were wide apart, the left thigh at right angles to the and the right forming an obtuse angle with the pubis. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed. The abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The viscera found in various parts, that's the body's internal organs, folks. With one breast under the head, the other breast, the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side. The skin and tissues of the abdomen from the costal arch to the pubis were removed in 3 large flaps and had been placed on a table. Her face was gashed in all directions, the nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears partially removed. The neck was cut through the skin and other tissues right down to the vertebrae, the 5th and 6th being deeply notched. Both breasts were removed, more or less, by circular incisions. Folks, tonight, the barbaric murders of Jack the Ripper. Now, tonight our guest, Paul Roland, investigative journalist and author of his new book called The Crimes of Jack the Ripper, strips away decades of myths and misconceptions to reveal a brand new suspect in the case. Be prepared to have assumptions turned on their head. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for horror and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome, one and all. Welcome, folks. Tonight, Jack the Ripper, the barbaric crimes of Jack the Ripper, with our guest tonight, Paul Roland, and his new book called The Crimes of Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel Murders Revisited. Paul, I want to welcome you all the way from just outside of Ottawa, by the way, folks. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great privilege to be on the show.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, you know, Jack the Ripper, as I mentioned at the outset, are romanticizing this guy whenever Hollywood puts a new movie out. The latest one, I think, was From Hell, starring Johnny Depp. We romanticize this guy. We shouldn't be doing that, should we? We should be looking at this guy as he was, which is a pure serial killer. I was just curious, how many actual murders are accredited to Jack the Ripper?
Well, it's actually believed that about 5. No ripperologist agrees on all of them. That's part of the problem. In fact, there's so many variables in the whole story that that's part of the fascination of it. Not only is it the who done it, but and of course we have the romanticism of the sort of Dickensian London and the characters, the fog, and the idea of this aristocrat sweeping through the streets in a cloak and top hat, which of course is complete nonsense, but that's understandable, of course.
Have we, Paul?
I'm glad you. So I must say, I'm glad you opened with that description, because really that does pour cold water on everything and reminds us that we are not romanticized. It was a very brutal and disturbing and distressing thing, and that's why I've put the emphasis on the victims in this book as much as on finding who the Ripper might be, because I think the story is not just about who was Jack the Ripper, but also who were the poor victims, not just the ones that, as you say, most people as the 5 canonical victims, but the peripheral characters are also very pathetic individuals, and it tells us a lot about society and human nature and the times and how people are marginalized in an uncaring society. So there's more to the story than just this shadow, this musical villain.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
www.nightfrightshow.com, folks. Click on tonight's guest book cover. We're talking about Jack the Ripper tonight with an explosive new book. Reveals at the end of the book a possible new character in all of this, a possible new person. May have been just that very person, Jack the Ripper. Roland's our guest, as I said, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover and read this one with the lights turned on. I want to follow up on that line of thinking as well. Now, very much when you watch the movies, it really is a class struggle when you watch the Hollywood movies. It's set up as you said, the folks that are peripherals, not a lot of money, prostitutes generally speaking, against the aristocrats, the rich. That is true in its essence, but it's much more detailed than just that black and white polarized type of scenario given by movies. Can we get into what it was like living in Whitechapel? That's where the murders took place, folks, in the 1880s.
Well, you had people living below the poverty line. You had people for whom a few pennies were the matter between life and death. In fact, one of the victims came within Jack the Ripper's lethal grasp simply because she couldn't afford a bed for the night, which was a couple of coppers. You had people sleeping across ropes because they couldn't lie down in a bed. You had 60 people to one room. I mean, it's quite a third world horror scenario. In fact, we can't even grasp, can't even imagine what it must have been like. So this idea of well, in fact, part of the fascination, I think, and part of the importance, the significance of Jack the Ripper, is that he stirred up social conscience at the time. Because these unfortunates, as they were commonly referred to, were thought of as people who had brought this upon themselves, this fate. There were very few people doing social work, as we would see it these days. The politicians were, of course, just as interested in their own self-interest as they are today. But of course, these things had a far wider implication, an impact on the unfortunates who were disenfranchised, or women didn't even vote then, of course. But and the thing to remember is that it was a very violent community, the East End at the time. You'd have people, extract that I give in the book. A journalist describes screams heard during the day. A woman runs screaming towards the journalist, pursued by a man who's obviously intent on beating her up. And it turns out he's a, but these were things were happening all the time. And the other thing, of course, is animals were slaughtered within sight of children. Okay, they were behind a fence or something, but children dared each other to wander in and see an animal's throat being cut. It was a very hard, harsh life. We won't even talk about the asylums, of course. You also have people, well, I won't go into the suspects, but there was a particular suspect, Montague Druitt, who drowned himself in the Thames simply because he was shamed into leaving his job as a school teacher because of alleged sexual
misconduct.
Misconduct, exactly. And he drowned himself and was subsequently named in a very irresponsible way by McNaughton, who was the chief of the police, who actually came after the crimes had finished. He named him in a famous memorandum, the McNaughton Memorandum, simply because the man had drowned himself just after the murders ceased, and so as good a suspect as any. But of course, that's completely his fault. And that's.
I was going to say.
I was just going to say that's the only reason why he was has persisted as a suspect, and for no reason of evidence at all.
At all. And Paul, that was something that I got out of your book, by the way, folks. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover, Jack the Ripper, folks. Read this one with your lights fully on. You can call a friend over. It is creepy, and of all the shows I do, folks, the ones that and I do a lot of ghosty shows and a lot of UFO shows, they creep me out, but nothing like serial killers. And I always get very disturbed after a show because these guys were real, and this is no different. This book has pictures of the crimes. This book has drawings of the crimes, first-person witnesses. He's done an immaculate job. Paul Roland is our guest tonight. Just click on tonight's guest book cover on the website, as always. Take you right to a spot where you can order the book. Is that one of the reasons, Paul, you had mentioned that this inspector came along after the crimes? Because the crimes were committed on ladies of the evening, prostitutes, working girls, if you will. Did the police drag their feet, do you think? Because it wasn't... Go ahead, let's talk about that, because that's another myth you broke down.
Yes, I feel, and it said in several points in the book, that they did a thorough job as they could under the circumstances. They put a lot of men on the streets. They were as determined to catch this man as you would want them to be, but they were on a hiding to nothing. They had no forensic evidence in those days, even though fingerprints had been invented shortly before. I think it was 1910. Well, sorry, 1910 was just after. But they had, of course, they had photography. Matthew Brady had photographed the battlefield of the Civil War. So they could have used photography, for example. But the only person who was photographed, the only victim, was Mary Kelly, the last victim that you described, in situ. The others were not photographed until, or drawings were taken, when they were taken to the mortuary, by which time, of course, it was too late. All we had is a brief description of how they were lying, where they were found, what was near the body, and so on. So that was just the way that the police conducted murder investigations at the time. Of course, they were surprised by all this because they were used to dealing with domestic murders, things that just sort of erupted suddenly, crimes of passion, where you didn't have to explain anything. The victim was killed.
Well, I'll tell you what.
The perpetrator said it's a fair cop, gov, and was dragged away, or ran off and was never seen again. So, actually, what usually happened was their friends betrayed them because everybody knew everybody else. They lived like rats in in a trap. So it was a completely different society. Today, you jump in a car, you're 100 miles away before the body's discovered, or you jump on a plane, for goodness sake. So,
Yeah, and you're on the other side of the universe.
See, the other thing was that that at one point the police, and this is an important point, at one point the police cut off the alleyways, the entrances and exits to a particular area, and within half an hour, I think they said 50 people were inside that cordon. They had come through narrow passageways that even the police didn't know about. The people weren't trying to infiltrate the cordon, they simply were moving in their business. And the other thing was, everybody left their doors unlocked in those days.
Yeah.
So, if you did something, you could turn around 30 seconds, you were in somebody's house, through the other side to another alley. Unless you had a helicopter, there was no way. And of course, if you'd been expecting to see somebody do something, you'd still have a devil of a job trying to catch them. So this was no chance. And really, they needed, dare I say, they needed a Jack the Ripper crime to stir themselves into thinking differently about how to.
Why is that, Paul? That's an interesting point you bring up in the book too.
Well, that this was the first modern serial killer. Before that, as I say, you had acts of violence, passionate murder, crimes of passion. You had all sorts of things which were premeditated. Here you have the first real serial lunatic who's acting irrationally. Now, I mentioned in the book that modern-day profilers have relooked at this case,
FBI
and what
guys.
they know, of course, which the original investigators wouldn't have had knowledge, was that serial killers tend to act within their zone of comfort, if you like. They would also show signs of sadistic behavior early in childhood. They would come before the courts for something in their teens, perhaps. So there would be a record that the police could have consulted had they considered this possibility. Therefore, certain names would have come to light, and then they could have interviewed these half dozen or however many people, put direct questions to them, confronted them, and if they didn't have an alibi, pursue it further. But there was so much, I won't say amateurish detective work, but it was, in particular, let's take the first murder, Marita Tabram, for example.
Very good. Yes.
Okay. She was seen in the company of a soldier, and she had been with a friend who had gone to entertain the other soldier. They were a pair out for a night's entertainment. Now, very shortly after...
Both ladies are prostitutes, by the way, folks.
Yes,
what would
right, working girls.
Yeah, sex trade.
Very shortly afterwards, the body was discovered. Now, any self-respecting sleuth would say, well, let's first go and interview the soldier. So they duly went. They interviewed the soldiers, and because one corroborated the story of the other, they stopped there. And there you have the first problem. It also looks, from the description of the wounds, that it was probably inflicted by a bayonet, even though she was stabbed many times. Now, anybody with any amount of common sense would at least make a strong suspect, let's say. But these things were not pursued, and there you have the beginning of the problem. If they couldn't even do that, what were they going to do later when they're dealing with face shadows and crowds? And of course, the other thing, which I make a strong point in the book, is that they jumped too quickly to the assumption that these various atrocities were all attributable to one person. And this, I think, is the fundamental mistake of most ripperologists. I think you have to look at where the bodies were found, look at the area, and I've discovered that certain victims killed, in fact, only 3 victims, which I tell you something very significant. 3 victims were killed north of Dorset Street, which was a central place where they all met in pubs and so on, and where my suspect lived. Whereas the dubious victims, the ones that we can't be quite certain of, lived south of Dorset Street. And it suggests that this person that we call Jack the Ripper stayed within a certain area, and he killed those 3, and somebody else might have been responsible for the others. So it's quite a different angle to the story, I think.
www.nightfrightshow.com. Folks, I want to come back to that line of thinking because, again, in the book, folks, he brings up all these wonderful ideas, thinking out of the box to solve this crime that is well over a century old now. These crimes took place, of course, Jack the Ripper, between 1888 approximately, and before Queen Victoria was still in power. Let's put it that way. And we're going to discuss the possibilities in a few minutes of perhaps Queen Victoria's monarchy being involved on the peripherals of some of this, and maybe that's one of the reasons for the cover-up. The book is called Jack the Ripper, www.nightfrightshow.com. Our guest tonight, Roland. Paul, when there was no databases in those days at all for the police to fall back on. If you suspected somebody, it's because an inspector had that person in their own head, in their own memory. Was there anything that came out of these murders that created modern day, if you will, or a path to a modern criminology?
No, I think the lessons weren't learned. There were so many lines of inquiry that were just allowed to let run loose. For example, there was a very good suspect, a very hot suspect called Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American, who was pursued. Well, first of all, he was allowed to escape, which is not a very good endorsement of the police at the time.
To the New World, back to New York.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then he was not confronted with this. He was not dragged back to account for his whereabouts. But I think the answer is no. There wasn't anything because the police were also not very well focused. They brought in different people. They gave them a chance, and they fired this person if they didn't come up with the goods. They gave it to somebody else. The evidence of the writing on the wall. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing.
J-U-W-E-S.
J-U-W-E-S, which of course led to the whole Freemason royal conspiracy thing. Now nobody really knows whether this written by Jack the Ripper. And
let's talk about that while we're right there.
One thing is, they could have taken a photograph of that to answer your question. They could have taken a photograph of that and then wiped. No harm would have been done, and they'd have preserved evidence. They could have studied the graphology. They could have looked at the spelling. They could have done all sorts of things, but things were just and there was, of course there was the leather apron that was found in one scene. Jumped to the conclusion, the Leather Apron will hunt for somebody called Leather Apron. Somebody was persecuted because they were known locally as Leather Apron, and so there were so many prejudices acted upon, things not acted upon for example, Robert James Lee's the psychic, who is actually featured in one of the Hollywood movies, Murder by Decree, that you mentioned, played by Donald Sutherland, was a real figure, even though it sounds fantastic. He did lead the police at one point after having several visions, which dismissed as a prank, of course, but he led them to a particular house of a particular doctor that he didn't personally know, but he sensed that this was the person. And of course, being an aristocrat, what did the police do? They had to take the wife's word for it, and even though he was allegedly mentally disturbed, shall we say, he was allowed to not be questioned. It wasn't done to question a man of that standing in his home or anywhere. So a lot of leads were simply not followed up, and that's not amateurish. It must have been very frustrating to the police at the time, to be fair to them. Inspector Aberline and the rest who were leading the inquiry. I think it's simply that they were frustrated by the mentality and the deference of the time. You have that in that society. The unfortunates were looked on as untouchables, if you like, dregs of society, and the opposite were untouchable in the other extreme. Allowed to be questioned. Their credibility, their was not to be questioned. And so, of course, in that environment, there was no way you were going to catch somebody. Never mind the maze of the labyrinth of streets and all the other practical problems they were, and of course the lack of forensic evidence. And then, of course, you had the misdirection of the Dear Boss letters. which I think is a very
Hang on,
important
I want to go back. I'll tell you why. I want to go back and cover. You had referenced that's a good movie, by the way, too. The one with Donald Sutherland in it, because I always like Donald Sutherland, Canadian actor. Uh, and he's a good actor. Doesn't have to be from Canada.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
I want to reference the movie Johnny Depp was in, and I had mentioned it before, From Hell, because that covers the whole Freemason lore as well as the royal family lore. I would like to cover that for the next few minutes and get that out of the way, because that's something you absolutely explode in your book, that whole mythology. Just let me tell folks who we're speaking with, and we'll come right back to that. All the way from Hockey Canada, folks, Paul Roland is joining us tonight with a fantastic book. Everything you always wanted to know about Jack the Ripper and more. And there's a lot more than what Hollywood portrays in its movies. Easy way to get the book, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And as I said at the outside, folks, this may be one of those books you want to leave the light fully on. Maybe call a friend to read this book. Well, it's real life, right, Paul? And
you can call me, I'll read it to you.
Okay, there you go. There's an invite.
Ticket.
There, yeah, no problem at all. Okay, Paul, let's jump into that whole Royal Freemason thing and bust that myth down too. That doesn't mean that the movie Johnny Depp isn't good. It's a really good movie, and it scares me as well to this day, and it's a real fun ride. But it seems to be a little bit disconnected from reality and the truth. Can we talk about the Freemason royal family connection?
Okay. Well, my research tells me or reveals that that story originated with the supposed son of Walter Sickert, the painter. It was Joseph Sickert who claimed to be Walter Sickert's son. We're not sure, and he wasn't able to prove his parentage. And that he conceived this as a sort of after-dinner story to entertain friends, and it was taken up by various authors. I think the first in the 1930s. So it's not something that came up in the 70s that inspired that first film we talked about, Murder by Decree, with Christopher Plummer and James Mason and Donald Sutherland, and then was put into a graphic novel by Alan Moore, played by Johnny Depp, in Hell. It's quite an old story. So it comes from the pre-First World War era with Sickert and various authors. Eventually, I think his name was Stephen Knight, if I remember, certainly his surname was Knight. He wrote a book which became very popular and very cleverly tied in all these elements of the secret rituals of Freemasonry, which did have an echo in the
case,
wounds, the injuries. Yeah. Yes, exactly, and certainly was very convincing and very entertaining in fiction and in the film. But there's no evidence at all linking any member of the royal household or even their servants who drove the hansom cab in the film, or any royal physician either, linking them to the murders of Jack the Ripper. I think we tend to look for overcomplicated things because we like to intellectualize, we like to rationalize. Now here, you see, we're talking about an irrational act by a very irrational individual.
Precisely.
So to attribute an intellectual process to this person to explain it is to completely miss the point. You're talking about I won't call it random acts of violence, but the trouble is the victims are mixed up with victims who were as a random act of violence. So you've got probably the core of three I'd say, Jack the Ripper victims, with 2, 3, maybe even more, because there were also earlier victims, you see,
right.
who were not necessarily murdered, but had injuries, very serious wounds, because a serial killer works their way up. They graduate from, say, sadistic acts with animals in their childhood, perhaps arson, perhaps other violent acts in their teenage years, to, as an adult, murder. But they wouldn't start just by killing somebody and eviscerating them. Serial killers would wound somebody gravely. They would maybe try to slit their throat and fail. There were all these other incidents. If you look at the police records, there were these other attacks shortly before the autumn of terror, as they called it, in 1888, and they might have been the first acts of Jack the Ripper as he learned his trade, you might say. On the other hand, of course, as I say, it was a very violent time and area, and there were acts of violence perpetrated by gangs on women who were not complying with their demands, shall we say, the pimps or who were clients, or as I said before, the soldiers, or who knows what. And there were sailors coming in on boats all the time. There were people moving in and out of that area all the time, drink all hours of the day and night to excess. There's not the laws that we have today. People had little. I don't want to sound prejudicial, but or even generalize too much. But of course, when people had no work and they had absolutely destitute, miserable lives, there wasn't much else for them to do but drink and try to forget. So a lot of
very little chance. Very little chance, Paul, of upward mobility in those days. I mean, there was no welfare system in place. There was no unemployment insurance. Education was, I mean, you were born into a class in those days, folks, and you died in that class. You just made the best you could out of it, and that was it. And a good movie is Titanic, and that took place in 1912. So. If you want to look at the differences between the class systems. Folks, if you're just joining us, we're just at the halfway point. Settle in, relax, get the feet up, get a cup of coffee going, get a cup of tea going, or a beverage of your choice, because we're looking at Jack the Ripper tonight. Turn the lights on right now. Do yourself a favor. Fantastic book from our guest from Hawkesbury, Ontario tonight, Paul Roland. The book is called Jack the Ripper, www.nightfright.com. Just click its guest book cover. That's going to take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And tonight's a good night for that. Paul, you had alluded to a diary. Now, I just want to preface this. Okay, in 1991, folks, workmen were carrying out renovations of an old English home, and when they knocked down a wall, an old beat-up diary fell out. Many are trying to say the real the Ripper penned it. Now, what's eerie about his diary is that the so-called diary references two objects found at the murders that were not revealed. Are you ready for this, folks? Now, the murders took place in 1888, don't forget. A full century later, they weren't revealed till 1987. Can we talk about that? Now, this to me, when I read that, and I'm getting them now, the old goosebump factor, as I like to say. Can we talk about this diary that was found? And then, as an extension of that, we'll talk about those letters and the press involvement in keeping this roller coaster rolling.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I have every reason to believe that diary was a fake. For one thing, the perpetrator of the supposed author of the diary was a poisoner, and serial killers don't change their modus operandi. The other thing was that the person who sold that diary, or who claimed to have found it and then to have sold it to a publisher, later confessed that it was a fake. There were ink tests done on it, which proved that an element, or an ingredient rather, of the ink had not been invented at the time the diary. And there's a few other things which just, but the confession is the main one. Of course, then you have this conspiracy thing where where people say, but he only confessed because, and they find a reason why somebody would confess. But the fact is, the man confessed, I made it up. So, there's no point going on and on, but he only confessed because, and trying to go back, to circle back again.
And that's the
once you're
point.
out of the
That's the point I want to make about his book, folks. Is the fact that he's done all the meticulous research, busting down all these myths that have perpetrated for a century, and he has come up with his own conclusion at the end of who the actual Jack the Ripper barbaric was, and that's a big hook to go get the book, folks, because this is the real deal, Jack the Ripper. Okay, let's talk about the press involvement in keeping, as I said before, this whole roller coaster going to sell papers, and the letters. There's a whole series of letters that were purported to be written by the Jack the Ripper murderer, sending them in, supposed to be clues in the letters. Can we talk about that whole conspiracy aspect of it all, too?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to take into account the fact that the police received over 400 letters in the course of this reign of terror. Most, of course, were written by crackpots, people who wanted to draw attention to themselves. Also, the two letters known as the Dear Boss letters, and the only ones that were signed Jack the Ripper, the one that actually gave the figure his sobriquet. The only reason why we call him Jack the Ripper is because these two letters, they were dismissed at the time because they were written obviously by an intelligent hand, somebody who tried to disguise their intelligence by making very obvious mistakes. And they also were expressed in a way that a deranged mind would not express themselves. Somebody who was so obviously in a state of collapse, and obviously a personality of that type disintegrates after a while, which is why the last murder was so total and so horrific. The murderer cannot actually handle what they have done at a certain point, and that sort of personality would not have written such, I won't call them eloquent letters, but they were certainly grammatically correct, apart from the very studied flaws, the very deliberate flaws. And I believe, I'm very confident in saying that they were actually written by two members of the Central News Agency. Bullingdon, I think, was the publisher, and Moore was his chief journalist. And this is the central argument of my book, without giving it away, is that they concocted this character they made a composite, if you like, a shadow, a boogeyman that would instill fear, but more importantly, raise the circulation of their newspapers. After all, at that time, there wasn't much else that was newsworthy. They had to make a living. There was a very fierce circulation war. They would have gone under. They would have lost their business, lost their livelihoods. They had to keep people buying their news. What better than either a sexual scandal or a monster roaming the street, and everybody's suspicious of their neighbor. Everybody's turning around. Who could it be? There's a new clue in the paper. I have to buy it.
Now,
and so they concocted these letters.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Paul, were the murders of Jack the Ripper unique in those days, in this sense that, I mean, there have been other murders going on as well? What was it about the Jack the Ripper murders that have us reading about them and being curious about them well over a century later? And what was Queen Victoria's attitude towards these, or were these just another stream of murders taking place in those days?
Well, we have the impression that they were unique. However, Ernst, I think his name was Ernst Kraft, a sociologist, a whole study of deviant and abhorrent behavior, which included many violent sexually obsessed individuals in Europe. So there were certainly individuals carrying out atrocities and crimes of that nature. However, they did not capture the public's imagination because they were, or appeared to be, sort of random. They were not considered the first acts of a serial killer. They were not tied together. It was the press who created the myth of Jack the Ripper by tying in unrelated victims, though, as I say, there may have been 3 which were carried out by one individual. So this was the essential thing that created the myth of the serial killer. This is why we are still fascinated more than 100 years later. But this is exploding the myth that there was no Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was the appellation given to the knife, as he was originally called, also the Whitechapel murderer later on. There was no Jack the Ripper. There was an individual who I named, and I'm pretty confident it was wrong. There are half a dozen or more candidates for the 3-4 killings, but the others, which I go into detail about, there's a very strong being acts of domestic violence, or pimps killing their women, or other violent acts. So it's the whole myth is just the first expression of what would you call it? Tabloid journalism, if you like. It's the first of this. It's the birth of this. That's why the Johnny Depp film, it opens with a quote: "I am the first expression. I give birth to the 20th century."
That's right. Yeah, that famous quote. Now, staying along those lines, and 1888. I want to come back to forensic evidence. Would there be a case for exhuming the bodies? Would we learn anything from exhuming the bodies, do you think?
Not now. No, it's far too late.
Far too late. Okay.
And there was that was another thing that they couldn't have done at the time because there's so much contamination. For example, at the scene, about the bodies, but at the scene, they would immediately slosh the pavement with water to wash away the blood, and of course the hair and everything else would be gone. People would be milling around. They wouldn't try to keep people back. It was absolutely hopeless. One thing I did want to say, actually, about the victims is that a lot of books have concentrated focus, naturally, on who was Jack the Ripper. But I think the lives of the victims and of the people who tried to catch Jack the Ripper are, if not, well, more fascinating because they were real people. We know what they did. We know what they suffered. We know their frustrations. We know how close they came to capturing him, the bits of bad luck.
One of those investigators stand out more above the other. For me, it's Aberline, of course. But in your own from your own perspective?
Well, I think that they all were pretty competent, and they were hard-working, dedicated individuals who haven't had the credit they deserve. And unfortunately, their superiors, particularly McNaughton, didn't support them, didn't value them, didn't rely on them enough, felt that they knew better, and so they had perfectly capable men who might have caught Jack the Ripper had they. It wasn't a question of resources, as I say. Poor men on the street doesn't necessarily mean you'll capture him. But I mean, in one case, for example, a bobby was doing his beat past the spot where the potential victim was. 12 minutes later, he'd come back. She was dead. So how are you supposed to catch somebody, if in 12 minutes like that? It's just impossible. They're on as I say, a hiding to nothing. There was no. It would have been by luck the way they captured the Yorkshire Ripper or somebody. But it was a different mentality then.
In those days, absolutely. Paul, I wanted to ask you too. One of the things that popped in my head, and I know you have your own character, your own murder suspect. There's a better word to use it. I thought right away it's got to be somebody who knows these girls, knows their patterns. And I thought perhaps it might be a fellow prostitute or even a male prostitute or a transvestite. What are your perspectives on that?
Well, I do address that possibility that it could have been Jill the Ripper, or it could have been a man dressed in women's clothing. But there are a number of reasons why I rule that out. And I think, although there was it's unlikely because of the strength that was needed,
Okay.
and the mutilations, which I think no woman would have committed on another woman.
And that's why
However,
I wondered
there
if it was a transvestite or not.
I think that we're getting into the realms of a bit of fantasy there, a bit, but we're stretching. I think the truth is far more down to earth, crude, and depressing, and that's why we don't really want to accept it. That's why we try to make it more fanciful, because it's more romantic, to use that word again.
Yeah.
The truth is probably quite sordid, and the individual is probably somebody that we keep 100 miles away from. Not Jack Palance or a Johnny Depp type figure. I know he played Abilene, but one of these romantic figures. He's far more likely to be a disturbed and rather brutish individual, but somebody who would to be so unprepossessing, somebody that you wouldn't give a second look in the street. And that's another reason he would get under the radar, because he would just pass in a crowd, particularly for the reason that I give, because of his profession.
Yeah. Folks, the book's called Jack the Ripper. You're going to want to get this one, but read it with the lights on, call a friend, and put the comforter up when you read this one. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover and order this book from the comfort of your own home, and it'll just arrive in the mail right away. Our guest tonight is Paul Roland. Paul, I want to ask you, can you walk us through the purported last killing of Jack the Ripper, Mary Kelly, and tell us some of the details around that, and just a quick synopsis without giving anything away from your perspective.
Okay. Well, as far as I can remember, she was seen by a man called Hutchinson talking to a potential client, but shortly before she died. But Hutchinson gave too much detail, and therefore I suspect he was either attempting to distract attention from suspicion from himself, whether he was guilty or not. He was a good suspect. And by that time, the police were looking to hang it on anybody, frankly. So, anybody was as good as anybody else, especially those days where people were disposable if they were of a certain class and maybe a criminal. Let's get this guy, and at least we'll have somebody. He's done other things. It's not exactly injustice. It's not like today you would, put some evidence on them and set them up, fit them up, as we say. They wouldn't have had much compunction about that. So I think we can dismiss that fellow. But she was seen in the company of a man early in the morning. She was very much the worse for wear, and she lodged in a really shabby little room underneath the room occupied by another woman who heard her singing. In fact, I think she brushed against Mary Kelly on the way to the room in the alley that night. And so the other woman couldn't sleep that night when she came back, and she could hear Mary Kelly singing, and then there was the sound of somebody leaving, and she didn't think to look out. I think this is something like 4 or 5 in the morning.
That's right.
And she thought, it could be somebody, a costermonger or somebody on their way to getting up early for work. But it was too early for that, and that was probably Jack the Ripper exiting. That was his last exit, we gather. But what's interesting about Mary Kelly's death is that as you described it at the beginning, she was completely butchered. She was dehumanized. In fact, they said only her eyes were in place, and that's how they recognized it. It was a very unbelievably disturbing scene. But some of her organs were in a fire in the grate, and it has been speculated that it may have been part of a ritual killing by somebody who was a religious fanatic and who had read into a passage of the Bible how to exorcise your sins. Now, if it says in this particular, I think it was Leviticus, says if you're living with beasts, you can expunge the sin by doing these various things, and that was quite a clear description of the injuries that she received. But then again, perhaps we're reading too much into it. There's other people who say that the theory is that the killings took place at locations which formed a cross or formed another. It depends how you look at the map. Of course, people who tend to come up with these theories look at modern day maps, and they don't realize that the streets were not exactly the same in Victorian times. So there's an awful lot of theories, some of them quite ludicrous, some of them quite plausible. This is what keeps the myth going. It's such a fascinating case because you could with any one of these things. But I tried to look at the witness statements, particularly. I mean, this is the closest you're going to get. If you're not going to have physical evidence, forensic evidence, at least look at the witness statements and see if you can find a consensus of opinion there. If two or three witnesses saw a man in his 40s who was 5'3" very shortly before the body was found, you're pretty certain, safe to say, that sounds like him. If you have a man of 6'4", and he's talking in a Polish accent, or he's not expressing himself very clearly with a woman, then, and the others were, you can probably rule him out. These sort of things. They had Kosminski and a few other characters who were mentally deficient, shall we say. They could hardly speak English. They were very dishevelled. A woman, even a prostitute of that class, would not have been seen in the company with that person. She wouldn't have entertained them. She'd have walked away, no matter how desperate she was. All these you have to use common sense and look at it the way that a modern investigator would look at it. Also look at the profiling. As I say, there's a lot of clues there. You can rule out some of these more eccentric. Yes, exactly. And I'm pretty sure that the man that was seen in Mitre Square, which was the night of the double murder, by 3 men, was the chap. He was 3 inches taller than the woman, so that gives you an exact measurement because they know how tall she was when she was taken to the mortuary. All her details were taken. So if he was 3 inches taller, that gives you a good physical description. What he was wearing, of course, he can change what he was wearing the next night. But how he spoke, they heard him speak. They had a brief glimpse, and they said he was a person they wouldn't want to ever meet again. They wouldn't, and they didn't even talk to him. They didn't even engage with him. There's so many little clues there if you look at these facts and forget about the speculation. I mean, we have the business of Patricia Cornwell, the crime writer, speculating and spending £4 million of her own money trying to prove theory instead of looking at the facts.
That was 1960, wasn't it? She did that?
No. She did this very recently, actually.
Oh,
I think she did it in the last 5 years.
Okay.
I think somebody else. And she had the idea that the painter Walter Sickert, to go back to him, may have been responsible because he painted some morbid pictures about the Camden Town murders, and she saw clues like a necklace, a string of pearls that she thought was a wound, and his neck and all these sort of things. But when you get down to the nitty gritty, as fanciful, as wonderful as this theory might be, 3 people confirmed that he was in France at the time of some of these murders. His own mother said how lovely it was to have spent 2 weeks with Walter, blah blah blah. So there's no amount of wonderful theorizing. And then she got DNA samples taken from the letters he wrote. And as I say, there were 400 crank letters. Are you going to say that each of those suspect? And she had the DNA taken, and it was mitochondrial DNA, which is not sort of substantial DNA.
Yeah.
And his manservant did the envelope or something. And you talk about years later anyway. Talk about corruption of evidence.
Of evidence. There's no way to keep it a clean evidence line.
Into that, the fact that 3 people, including his own mother, were with him when he was in France. Now, even a rich man or a wealthy individual would not have taken the night boat or whatever over to England, committed a murder for the jolly, and zipped back the next day, and then been relaxed with his friends. I mean, you're talking about the act of somebody who is so worked up that they storm out of their house within a few hundred yards of where they live. They see a unfortunate woman. They ask her if she's available, and if she refuses because they look demented or she's frightened of them, he may take out his anger on them. That's what we're talking about. Something as basic as that. Not a great conspiracy of somebody in a carriage taking their master, who's a physician with a rare disease or something. It's too convoluted. We have to make things simpler. Murder generally behave like that. Maybe these days they may construct an elaborate torture chamber in the basement or something on a trailer and all this kind of thing. But even then, the mentality of murderers generally is very low. I mean, they are indulging their basest instincts.
Bingo.
And they will eventually be caught. They will also, as we say, disintegrate. Their personality will disintegrate under the pressure of this tremendous, awful secret that they have. This thing that maybe their everyday mind can cope with and rationalize. These women are drive men to sin, so I'm going to expunge the streets of them. But in the end, their unconscious mind cannot cope, and they'll collapse, and they're very unlikely to commit suicide because they won't be plagued by their conscience. They'll also feel that they're right. That's why it's unlikely that, say, Dr. Cream, who confessed on the scaffold to being Jack the Ripper, or some other people who confessed on their deathbed to being Jack, would have been there, because Jack the Ripper would not have, admitted to this. He'd be right. He'd be wanting to outfox the police. He's far too clever for the police, as he would think,
It sounds like they were just trying to latch on to fame as their lasting legacy. And when I speak of lasting legacy, for better for worse, we had touched on the lives of these women, and I think they have become immortalized and perhaps humified, there's not even a word there, more humanistic by our looking into their lives and examining their lives. I hope that is the lasting legacy of these murders, and we don't focus so much on Jack as your book does, but on the victims, and I give you full kudos. Our guest tonight has been Paul Roland, folks. The book is called Jack the Ripper, The Whitechapel Murders Re-Examined, and as we've been talking about, he's gone through meticulously all the research surrounding the murders and has come up with a brand new suspect. And to read that, you've got to buy the book. www.nightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Thank you very much, my friend, and looking forward to seeing you in the near future.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show, Brent.
Thank you, Paul. Folks, I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Night Fright, and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.